Hello and welcome to this video, and on this video I'm going to be ranking the albums of Jethro Tull. Jethro Tull are one of the biggest selling progressive rock bands of the classic period, and it is that period I will be looking at. I'm going to be ranking the albums from 1968 to 1980, covering that period when classic rock was at its peak. Right, now before we start, there's a couple of things I need to tell you. This video will be in two parts. Part one, I will rank the albums. I'm going to try and fly through that as quick as I possibly can, because there's some people complain that I talk for too long and too much, and they just want to hear the ranking. So we'll do that. So for those of you with ADHD or short attention span, you will just get a quick ranking with a quick justification of why I put the album there. Then in part two, I'm going to go through the albums one by one and try and show the story of Jethro Tull from my point of view. And of course, this is all my opinion. Now, my opinion is that of quite an ignorant listener. When I was a young progressive rock fan and I discovered this band, I decided to go out and buy MU, The Best of Jethro Tull, to check them out. This became one of my favourite albums. I listened to it all the time. I thought all the tracks were fantastic on it. And so I then got some rock encyclopedias, got my Rolling Stone book of rock and roll out, started reading magazine interviews. And this idea came out that Jethro Tull had started off great. They were really brilliant. They made this great album, Thick as a Brick. And then after that, they became self-indulgent, lost their way, were unfocused, started to change all their styles into things that, wasn't the signature style that they'd had. And that they'd made a lot of duds. And so there's a whole bunch of albums I never checked out. As time's gone on, I have listened to these albums, and I knew they were a lot better than the critics had said, in all these various books and magazines. But when it came to doing a ranking video, I knew my knowledge wasn't great enough. That's why you haven't seen one on this channel. So about a month ago, I decided to put my headphones on and start listening through these 12 albums, making notes and putting scores on them. What shocked me was that all these albums are great. They're absolutely fantastic. They're more than fantastic. In fact, I would say that Jethro Tull have the best hit rate in terms of quality of any of the progressive rock bands. There are no duds in this list, right? Which has made it quite difficult to rank, to be honest. I would compare them to Gentle Giant as being a band that came out and just produced masterpiece after masterpiece. But in Gentle Giant's case, there is one dud, isn't there? Giant for a Day. There's no duds here. Jethro Tull also share something else with Gentle Giant, and this is the application of the English aesthetic into rock music. I would say Jethro Tull are probably exemplar of this, along with Gentle Giant. The English aesthetic I've talked about a lot on this channel, but it's this idea of bringing English culture and English history in to rock music, but also bringing sort of an anarchic comedic element, which comes almost from the idea of the court jester, but through things like the Goons and through things like Monty Python, and you can hear a very strong Monty Python influence in Jethro Tull. So really, this band is exactly up my street. It's absolutely fantastic. I don't know whether this ranking is right, because I felt I was comparing one great album after the next, but I've tried my best. So in part one, I will be ranking the albums, and then once I've done that in part two, I will go through in further detail. So I hope that will keep everybody happy. So let's get on with the rankings, shall we? So at number 12, I have the debut album, This Was. This is a very fine album, made by a band emerging out of the sort of blues rock boom that's going on in the UK at that time. It shares its DNA with Fleetwood Mac. It shares it with Cream, okay? The lineup at this point was a quartet. There's no keyboard player here, although they did get John Evan in at some point to do session keyboards, and he later became a member of the band on vocals and flute and guitar. We have Ian Anderson on lead guitar, we have Mick Abrams. On bass, we have Glenn Cornick. And on drums, we have Clive Bunker. Mick Abrams only stays for this one album. He was far more interested in making blues than the aesthetic that Ian Anderson wanted to pull into this band. So after this album, he was gone. And because of that, this is not the sound you associate with Jethro Tull. But it's a very fine album. And it's only for that reason that it's at the bottom of the list. So that's what I've got at number 12, is this was. The tracks that I really liked on it, bearing in mind this is one of the albums I've never really listened to, I thought the first two tracks come on and it's standard blues, 12-bar blues. You've got 3 chords going backwards, forth. It is not the sophisticated twisting sound we associate with Jethro Tull. The Beggar's Farm comes on, great track, lots of nice flute playing from Ian Anderson. There's a track called Move Alone, which features Mick on vocals. The record label wanted Mick to sing. I think they thought that Ian Anderson's strange English quirky tone wasn't commercial. How wrong they were. Move Alone also has some great brass arrangement from Dee Palmer, who was their arranger throughout this period, is integral to the sound of Jethro Tull, I have to say that. They do an arrangement of Serenade for Cuckoo by Roland Kirk. Rassan Roland Kirk is one of the great jazz saxophone players and flute players. And Ian Anderson, who'd only taken the flute up, relatively close to the recording of this album, he wasn't like a flute virtuoso or anything, takes his inspiration from that overblowing and singing and all that type of stuff. It's absolutely fantastic stuff. And this band really is a good example of that breed of bands that came out of the UK in the 60s that were not only blues rock, but that were bringing in influences from jazz, especially the hard bop groups. That's absolutely fantastic. The best track is possibly Dharma for One, and we can hear on that the beginnings of the Jethro Tull sound. Okay, good album, just not representative of Jethro Tull. The next album I have on my ranking is War Child. Now, War Child is a really great album. It's got incredible classic tracks on there. It's undone a little bit by the fact that the critics were going for them at that time, and they seem to be stumbling, which is very interesting for this band because, Jethro Tull had huge success by going their own way, pulling in influences that you wouldn't think of as being commercial. But the critics got to them at this point, and this is a slightly unfocused album. It's absolutely fantastic. There's some great playing on there. They're moving away from creating the big, long epics at this point. They're trying to create shorter songs, and I think that hems them in. I think they had more epics to say. But it's a very, very good album. I also think it's hampered by having a pretty rubbish cover. Jethro Tull's covers had always been fantastic up to this point, really opulent and interesting. And this one, which features sort of a negative Ian Anderson in front of sort of a colour photograph of I think it's a cityscape or something, and it looks like a police badge with water. It just doesn't work. The rear cover of them all on the back's absolutely fantastic. And I know that affected my want to purchase this album. It looked to me like they'd moved to sort of AOR, sort of like Bachman Turner Overdrive or something like that, which of course they hadn't. But what's interesting is that they occupied that sphere in America especially. Jethro Tull were a huge concert draw and, album selling band in America at that time. I'll just check out my notes and see what I've put on it. Skating Away on the Thin Ice of a New Day has always been one of my favourite Jethro Tull songs. And I think if somebody wanted to say, what's Jethro Tull sound like? I'd go, well, listen to this. It really exemplifies what Jethro Tull are. So on an album, which I've got at number 11 on this list, we have absolutely classic progressive rock tracks like that. Again, Dee Palmer, incredible orchestral arrangements on this tune. I think when you listen to the album, it starts off and it's not quite peak Jethro Tull. And then in the middle, when Bungle in the Jungle comes on and all that sort of stuff, there's a really strong middle, and then it tails off. So this, I think, is not a dud at all. You can buy this album and have a brilliant example of Jethro Tull and what they do. But I think this is the closest they come to making a dud. But I don't even want to say that. It's absolutely not the case, you know. Great album at number 11. So at number 10, we have Too Old to Rock and Roll, Too Young to Die. This was made in 1976. Again, it's in this period when they're getting it kicking from the critics. Ian Anderson, who is a very knowing and intelligent composer and lyricist, I think Ian Anderson is possibly the greatest lyricist to be produced by the progressive rock genre, is dealing with something which is going to be explored by punk. It's almost like he is considering the same issues as punk at the same time, because this is 1976 as British punk is starting to emerge. And what's very interesting is that anarchic sort of approach to sort of performance, there's sort of lots of the eyes and stares and all that type of stuff, I believe had some influence on John Lydon, Johnny Rotten from the Sex Pistols. Again, as a kid, I thought, oh, this must be the album where they went punk. It's not the case. It's an absolutely fantastic album. And I think it's a little bit stronger than War Child. I think the production's fantastic, and it has some really classic tunes on there. Okay, so at number 10, so that was number 10. At number 9, and this will be the first shock. Like I said, I'm not too sure in my relative ignorance of Jethro Tull whether I've got this one right, because on many lists this comes out as number 1, and I'm sure people are going to howl that I have put this so low. But at number 9, I have Benefit, which is the the third album, isn't it? Yes. This is the album that follows Stand Up. It's a darker album than that. It's a very, very strong album. We're starting to see the themes and sound that are going to influence Aqualung, which then becomes a huge hit album for them and establishes them, which is why we're talking about them now. I listened to this and just could not get into it. The sound on it, it's not quite what I want from Jethro Tull. I've made some notes here. Let's go and grab this so I don't have to keep leaning over. So I made some notes here when I was listening to it, and I put, To Cry You a Song is great. Because you got to remember, Stand Up's one of my favourite Jethro Tull albums, the first actual proper album I got, and I absolutely love that. And that has a closer sound for me to Benefit. But the thing I find really surprising about this album, this is the period where record labels would not let you put your singles on your album. And so we are missing a number of tracks which I think are amongst my favourite, you know, Jethro Tull songs, which I think were recorded around about the same time or in the same sessions. That is, of course, the incredible Living in the Past, probably the greatest hit record, and it was a hit record for them, that's in 5/4, and it rivals Take 5 by Dave Brubeck, and it takes its inspiration from that. Fantastic. We've got The Teacher not on here, which was included on MU, the best of them. I love that track. And Which Is Promise, which I think was another hit. Of course, if you buy these expanded versions, because Stephen Wilson, who's a massive Jethro Tull fan, has gone through and remixed them all, you will get all that stuff. I didn't consider those on this because I had those tracks on Living in the Past, the compilation album from this period, which I haven't included. And I would actually rank that very close to where Stand Up is. I'd put it right up there. So if you buy Benefit now, you get those tracks, and that would put the ranking up. But I think in terms of looking at the actual albums that were released in the 70s, I don't think Benefit is the strongest from what I'm now going to call the bunker period. So we have the bunker period when Clive Bunker was on drums, and then he goes and we get the Barrymore Barlow period on drums, which I'm going to call the Barry period. A lot of people would think that Benefit is the best album from the bunker period, and I understand that. But for me personally, and I went through this over and over again, it's not as strong as Stand Up, which is a classic album. Now, this might be that I've been listening to Stand Up since I was a very young man, you know, so I love every single track on that. But things like Fat Man, which has this incredible sort of balalaika and tabla sound, and they suddenly expand their sound out on that, and it sounds absolutely incredible. There's no blues rock band or even progressive rock band creating in 1969 a sound like that. Absolutely incredible. We'll get to Stand Up in a bit. So at number 8, I have Heavy Horses. Now, the idea is that in the later period of the 70s, Jethro Tull sort of got their mojo back a little bit, and they went to sort of English folk music, and they made a trio of albums: Songs for the Wood, War Child, and Stormwatch. These 3 are incredible albums. Heavy Horses is a fantastic album. The themes of this album are quite interesting, because on Songs of the Wood, they explore this sort of esoteric English aesthetic, which of course I absolutely love. It's all mystical, it's all Green Men and Will-o'-the-Wisps, it's all got that type of stuff. On Heavy Horses, they go back to this, you know, hard rural life. They look at sort of country life and the way these ideas and processes have been worn away by modern culture. And it's much more visceral. On Songs of the Wood, you can see Ian Anderson sat in the forest with all his cooking materials, and it is very Will-o'-the-Wisp. On this album, he is in between 2 resplendent horses, holding them, looking like a man who works the land. And I'm just less keen on that aesthetic. And then the third one, Stormwatch, explores the coast around this country. There's a little mini epic on here called Lullaby, and it's absolutely fantastic. Now, it's worth saying on the early albums, Ian Anderson would often double track his voice, and that's a very attractive sound. When they go into the classic prog period, he stops doing that. On this, his voice is quite gruff, and looking into this, I think this is the beginning of his vocal problems, which have sort of plagued him more recently, but they go right back almost 40 years. And so they've double tracked some of the voice, and I really like that. As I'm going on here, I'm not going to be able to come up with any criticism. We're talking about this much difference in terms of these albums. They're all fantastic. At number 7, I have the aforementioned Stormwatch, which I think is even stronger than Heavy Horses. The production's incredible. I thought, you know, looking at the cover and the period of time it was in 1979, when no prog band was making any great prog albums, and we come on here and say, oh, UK in 1978 was the last great progressive rock album. No, it wasn't. Stormwatch is absolutely fantastic. It delivers everything you want from Jethro Tull. And it's this idea of this trilogy, and then looking at the sort of the sea, looking at sailors, looking at the myths that surround that, the idea of being cut off on an island, of staring out into the sea, and the contemplation that goes with all that. It's all fantastic themes. And I think this is one of the things that really sets Jethro Tull apart. They are able, through their use of the English aesthetic, to bring in these themes without getting into the sort of wizards and dystopian science fiction stuff that plagues other progressive rock bands. There is something of immense intellectual depth about the subject matters, but the subject matters is dealt by Ian Anderson in a quirky way. And when I get to really go through what I think is great about Jethro Tull and go through the albums one by one, I will explain that more. On Stormwatch, they're hitting really hard. This is a fantastic album, but of course it was the last album to come out of this sort of classic 70s band, the Barrymore Barlow band. Their bass player, John Glasscock, was ill at this time, and he subsequently died. And that really changes the nature of Jethro Tull. The follow-up album to this, I think rightfully, I have not ranked, because I think from that point on, Jethro Tull are a different beast. And I just wanted to look at that. I may well look at the 80s albums and the 90s albums in the future. But for me, the interest is on these albums. And I feel Stormwatch is the last classic Jethro Tull album. Not to say there's not fantastic albums, you know, later on. And I did go through and listen to them. And it's such a different story. I couldn't encompass the story on... Encompass? I don't even know how you say that. I wasn't being able to nail the full story in one video, and I'm almost up to 20 minutes already, and I said I was going to do a short ranking. So we're up to Stormwatch. At number 6, I have the aforementioned Stand Up. It's my favourite of the bunker period. As I said, I listened to it since I was a young guy. I really think they nail their sound on this album. It's quirky, it's English, it's folky, it's jazzy. It's got the Bach Barré on there, which is fantastic, with 2 flutes, because what's incredible and what changes this album is the bringing in of Martin Barre, who seems to be quite a sort of inexperienced but very able guitarist. And he was able to be moulded in a way by Ian Anderson. But his first instrument was flute as well. It's absolutely bizarre. So he plays the second flute on that. Absolutely fantastic stuff. At number 5, I have Aqualung. Now, Aqualung is the last of the bunker period, and it follows on from Stand Up, from Benefit. It's a little bit heavier, and in a way, the actual sound of it in some places is a little bit more accessible for an American audience. It's really interesting that this band crossed over and turned Jethro Tull into an arena-filling band out in the States. This album sold 7.5 million copies, right? It's full of classic Jethro Tull songs, including Aqualung and Locomotive Breath and all these type of things, which became FM staples out in the States. It's very difficult to rank this one for me. It almost sits on its own in the whole thing. It doesn't quite sound like the other albums. It's enabled by a fantastic cover which was painted by a famous watercolor artist who I can't remember his name, and the image of the sort of tramp, which sort of relates to this idea of the observer, but the anarchic observer, of an untrustworthy source, and all this type of stuff is another theme that starts to go through these albums. It's a fantastic album, absolutely brilliant. It's a masterpiece. Stand Up's a masterpiece. All these albums from now on are masterpieces. It's very hard to pull them apart. So, at number 4, I have Songs from the Wood, which is the first in this sort of folk trilogy. Anyone that thinks they're going to hear Fairport Convention, no. What we've got is an incredibly complex album full of really mathematically difficult Jethro Tull arrangements. If somebody asked me to play Songs from the Wood, it would frighten me as a drummer. It's all over the place. Barrymore Barlow is an absolute virtuoso, possibly the greatest rock drummer of the 1970s. I know John Bonham thought so, and when somebody said, to John Bonham something like, what's it like being the greatest drummer, he said, we're going to ask Barrymore Barlow. And he was so great that in the 80s he went on to play with Robert Plant, and he went on to play with Jimmy Page, because they had considered him as the drummer for Led Zeppelin. Barrymore Barlow is just an incredible musician. He's all over Songs from the Wood. It explores that esoteric sort of mystical aspect of the English aesthetic, which I absolutely love. It's one of my favourite albums by them. Right, at number 3, I have Minstrel in the Gallery. Minstrel in the Gallery is supposed to be from this period when they were self-indulgent and over the top. I just don't think this is the case. And what's incredible about this album is that Thick as a Brick and Passion Play were this sort of progressive rock albums like Dark Side of the Moon and Close to the Edge that had been created into the studio with overdubbing and editing and all that type of stuff. But Jethro Tull is an incredible band, and on Minstrel in the Gallery they go back into playing live, and you can feel it. By this point, Jethro Tull had become heavier and heavier, and it's one of their heaviest albums. And they're doing all the stuff you would expect on a Jethro Tull album. I almost feel that this could be the exemplary Jethro Tull album. And there's a lot of acoustic stuff on here, and I love acoustic Jethro Tull. It just kicks and it rocks, and you can really hear the level of virtuosity of this band. Now, Ian Anderson's gone on to say that, bands like Yes were far more virtuoso than they were. And there's always this idea that the musicians in this band were like sort of a little bit inexperienced, John Hammond, who was the bass player, was like he was like Ian Anderson's mate, and they pulled him in and he just had to learn the parts. And I'm listening to the bass player thinking, oh my God, well, if he did that, how did Ian Anderson get so great on the flute in such a quick time? How does John Hammond become so brilliant on the bass in such a short period of time? I'm going to talk about this all later. But Minstrel in the Gallery, I think in terms of a playing band, of a sound of Jethro Tull, maybe they're at their peak. At number 2, I have Passion Play. Now, Passion Play was the big prog follow-up to Thick as a Brick. And of course, that means at number 1, I have Thick as a Brick. So let's talk about those two albums together, shall we? Thick as a Brick is their first proper progressive rock album. And it's made as a response to the critics who were turning around and saying, you know, this is progressive rock. They made a concept album. And Ian Anderson thought, well, it's linked. Some of the songs are linked, but Aqualung is not a progressive rock album. Right, if you want a progressive rock album, let's do a progressive rock album. And they make, perhaps with Thick as a Brick, the most proggiest prog album of all time, except it's all made with a knowing nod. It's all a bit, you know, look at Yesterday LP. It's a satire. It's like Monty Python decided to make a progressive rock album and embed it in their folklore. Of course, we have the famous newspaper album cover with all the stories that must have taken weeks to make. You know, you can read all these little stories, all the photographs featured of all the people surrounding that band. Thicker Than a Brick is a masterpiece, without a doubt. It's one of the great albums from 1972. When the album was done, they then went in and started to make Passion Play. And fueled by the huge selling success of Thick as a Brick, they make the most massive progressive rock album with the whole track that goes over side 1 and side 2. It's just an utter masterpiece. Passion Play is a masterpiece, but it got slated by the critics. I never bought it. I really wish when I was 14, 15 years old, I would have bought that album. So these albums are brilliant. Anyway, that's my ranking. So I'm just going to run through that again before we get into part 2. So at number 12, I have This Was, the debut album. At number 11, we've got War Child. At number 10, Too Old to Rock and Roll, Too Young to Die. At number 9, we have their third dark album, Benefits. At number 8, we have Heavy Horses. At number 7, Stormwatch. Number 6, Stand Up. Number 5, Aqualung. Number 4, Songs from the Wood. Number 3, Minstrel in the Gallery. Number 2, A Passion Play. And number 1, Thick as a Brick. I hope you enjoyed this ranking. If you did like it, then please put a like on it. If you want to see some more, subscribe. If you want to become a patron, then the link's down below. And if you want to tip me, you can put a tip in my PayPal tip jar. So all of you with a bit of ADHD, that don't want to hear. So I mean, you're probably sat there going, Andy, you've just spoken for half an hour on your ranking. Old Pete Pardo, he gets through it in 10 minutes. I don't know how he does it. I'm really trying to go as fast as I possibly can. It is probably being English that has done it, I think we like to take our time and make sure we get all the details in, and make sure we do a good job. So let's go into part 2 and then go through these albums in order and try and expose the story from my sort of ignorant, naive point of view and see whether you hardcore Jethro Tull fans agree with my assessment of what actually went on with this band. Let's go right back to the beginning. And I'm going to wend my way through. Jethro Tull are there right at the beginning. It's not like Gentle Giant or Yes or ELP that don't get into doing this until 1970. They are signed and releasing an album in 1968. They've been around since about 1966. A lot of this sort of things that we would call progressive rock, which I would say the sort of quirkiness and the sort of bringing in improvisation and jazz into the mix, is there on the first album. So they are a pretty important band in the history of progressive rock, but they are not progressive rock. They are an example of the zeitgeist of the time in the UK. They're pushing the envelope. They're experimenting and exploring ways of playing music. One of the things that's interesting at this point is Ian Anderson is your typical English man, and he is not a part of this hippie scene that's around him. He gets offered to play at Woodstock and turns it down because he doesn't like all that hippie nonsense and taking your clothes off. So we see right from the start there's something else going on with this band, and they're a quirky band, but they're also very serious in the way. And this is like a bunch of bizarre bank managers that have decided to form a band. That's what it feels like to me. The name Jethro Tull refers to some guy that invented the seed drill or something. I don't really know, to be honest, but some, old English farmer or scientist or whatever you call it. I haven't explained that bit as well at all, but the point is, it really points to the UK's past. And that's really interesting at this time when all the hippies are looking for this utopian future, that they are looking back into the great past of England. Now, why is that the case? And I think it's this, and I think Ian Anderson, being an intelligent guy, realised this with the early Jethro Tull. You can only, as an English or British musician, play the blues and it be in any way artistically valid. Certain singers that are from not too far from here that sing about the levee has always been quite interesting, because how can you really sing a song about a levee when you come from West Bromwich? Because it's just up the road, and I've looked for the levee in West Bromwich and there isn't one. I think progressive rock is born out of this idea of how do we play rock music, but from a British perspective, how do we bring our culture into it? And that's very important, because that's where the form comes from. And I think Jethro Tull, more than any band at this time, you've got Syd Barrett's quirkiness, we've got King Crimson pulling in a sort of esoteric folk thing on that album. It's not to 1969. So this is very interesting to me, that's what we have on the first album, This Was. But we also have a band which is at the beginning of their career but almost at the end of their career, which is why the album is called This Was. It should really be called This Was Jethro Tull. Another thing that I want to mention about this album is the bizarreness of the cover. They look strange on it. I don't know how to put it into the words, but it features them in a forest stood next to a pile of dogs that seem very happy in their sort of hanging about, and they look strange, The lineup on there has got John Evan, who wasn't a member of the band, and he looks like a garden gnome. In fact, they all look like garden gnomes. It's the strangest thing. The closest to a rock star they had was Glenn Cornick, and Glenn Cornick was the hippie hellraiser of the band. The rest of them were married men and they were very sensible, but Glenn Cornick wasn't, and he starts to cause trouble. And as Ian Anderson, eventually boots out Mick Abrahams, then he gets control of the band, which you can hear on Stand Up. Glenn Cornick is a fantastic bass player. They're an incredible band. Clive Bunker's an incredible drummer. This is one of the most virtuoso bands that are playing on the scene in 1968-69. They really are incredible players. Martin Barr comes in and really adds something because he can sort of do so much more. It's a little bit like Steve Howe coming into Yes. And Martin Barr, I feel, is very, very underrated in all of this. Once they have that band, the band that then makes Stand Up, they're pulling off all sorts of tricks, but they're really exploring their own aesthetic. You could call this progressive rock if you want. When you listen to the first album, the bringing in of classical influences, the sort of jazz improvisation, the experimentation, all the different, eclectic sounds on there, does give you a feel of progressive rock. I think what I'm really saying here is with these albums, Jethro Tull, along with a couple of other bands, are really laying the groundwork of what progressive rock's going to be. But in a way, they're doing it unknowingly and they're going their own path. They don't care what the critics say. On Benefit and then the follow-up, Aqualung, by that point, they have really carved out their own sound. And to everybody's surprise, this is hugely successful. Now, let's examine why it was so successful. Well, I think in America, when the Beatles went over and they turned up all chirpy and cheeky and, you know, a bunch of likely lads, and then they started to bring all these elements in from Lewis Carroll and from Music Hall and George Formby and all this type of stuff. I feel that Great Britain's greatest export is our Englishness or our Britishness. I think those sorts of stereotypes have gone around the world and people like them. I think people like jazz and blues because it exemplifies freedom and democracy. And people like the English aesthetic because it exemplifies a sort of strange, cosy counterculturalism, which I think the Beatles had as well. And it could have well been that the Beatles paved the way for Jethro Tull to come in and become this huge selling band, okay? And I think Ian Anderson, who is a very literate person, goes to the English literary tradition, right? He is exploring things that really, for me, come from people like Milton and Chaucer. I think those things are really embodied in Jethro Tull's sound. And on Aqualung, it puts across an image, because as a young kid, I would look at the cover of Aqualung and I would listen to the track Aqualung and I would hear this horrible, smelly, snot-ridden tramp, you know, looking out and being an observer, but he was not a trustworthy observer. I don't mean that he was lying. I mean, his intentions weren't honourable. And he's eyeing up all the little girls as he looks around. It's a very strange aesthetic, which, as a young guy, I just assumed that guy on the cover was Ian Anderson, not the tramp. So Ian Anderson becomes that. And when you see them live, it's quite astonishing. I really think Jethro Tull are just underrated. The virtuosity level is incredible. The stuff they're pulling off is incredible. If you listen to the live videos of Jethro Tull throughout the 70s, it sounds like a record. They're flawless. I didn't mention on my ranking list the live album Bursting Out, which could well be one of the greatest progressive rock live albums of all time, if not the greatest. Now, I can't remember whether I included it in my list of the 10 greatest progressive rock albums, live albums. If I missed it, you can all have a go at me and say, Andy, you got that wrong. And I did get that wrong, but it's interesting that I did. It's interesting that I didn't consider them. Not only are they incredible performers live, not only that it sounds so perfect, they never seem to make a mistake. You watch Ian Anderson and he is playing acoustic guitar and pulling off all this stuff while singing at the same time, then picking up a flute, and his performance with the flute is incredible because it almost comes like a magic wand. Or even more than that, the sort of bells of the court jester that he twists and turns, and the flash of the chrome, you know, on stage. And the whole band are so iconic in their strangeness. When Glenn Cornick's sort of on-tour fornication became too much and he just wasn't around because he was too busy pushing his charisma onto the ladies of America, and he got the boot, Ian Anderson brings in his friend John Hammond, that they rechristen John Hammond because it sounds more like a bank manager or a firm of solicitors. And this idea that as time went on, Ian Anderson is bringing in his friends. It's like he's getting rid of certain people. He's bringing in his friends. You know, Clive Bunker goes for very English reasons. If it's the reason why I stopped playing in Frost back in 2009. It's because I want to settle down and have a family. I didn't want to be going away and doing gigs. I wanted to be sat down, you know, looking after my family. It's a very English, responsible thing. Now, a few years back, I used to play in a band called Quill. And they're sort of similar to Jethro Tull in a way. They're not the virtuosity, but they take a sort of quite, you know, exuberant rock sound, and they mix it with a very folky English sound, which explores the English aesthetic as well. When I was playing in Quill, which is sort of like a local legend in terms of the Midlands as a band, huge following in the Midlands, nowhere else, just in the Midlands. There was two drummers in that band. There was me and Bev Bevan, because there's a lot of percussion work in that band. So Bev would often play percussion and I would play drums. But when we played the Bev Bevan tunes, we would swap over. And I believe we did a couple of Jethro Tull songs at some point. Anyway, I digress. at one point in the band, I was doing some other gigs and they were playing some gig at a festival, blues festival, and they couldn't do it. So I said, I can't do it. And Bev said, I'll see if I can get a dep. So Bev went and rings up Clive Bunker, his mate. And my dep on the gig was Clive Bunker. Now, I didn't know this. And the guitarist at the time, he says, do you want to come around and meet the dep and tell him, you know, just go through the set? And I went, yeah, okay then. So toddled around to my mate's house, knocked the door, sat down, and sat at the kitchen table was Clive Bunker. So I never talked to him about the date. I talked to him about him being mates with John Bonham and his time in Jethro Tull, and it was very interesting. They seem to be, all the way through this, they seem to be a band that were very friendly and chummy, and I think there was a lot of camaraderie there. But I think Ian Anderson had a vision, and I get the feeling that Ian Anderson could well be on the spectrum. That is my opinion, and there's nothing wrong with that. Creative people tend to be on the spectrum, and I think he's got a very strong vision for what he's trying to do, and it's very intellectual, but he's made it work. And this is very interesting because after Jethro Tull, he then becomes a salmon farmer, and then he becomes a millionaire at that because he makes it work. This is a very focused person. This is not a Keith Moon. This is something else that we don't associate with rock and roll. Where am I going with this? I think all these things are apparent to create the success. And I think part of it is their live performance, which is just jaw-dropping. And as I was saying, all the members of the band, you know, you've got John Evan, who's another friend of Ian Anderson, brought in, you know, why don't you come and play keyboards for us? And he was sat there with his pink suit and his little bow tie, looking very strange. John Hammond's walking around with his stripy bass and his stripy suit. Barrymore Barlow's at the back with his hat on. It's all very iconic. And of course, there's nothing more iconic than Ian Anderson stood on one leg with his jockstrap on, playing the flute. When I bought MU, the best of Jethro Tull, they were able to do something on there that I think only Freddie Mercury, Elvis Presley and Michael Jackson could do, which is where you cut out an outline of the lead singer and you put it on and you look at that outline and go, oh yeah, that's Jethro Tull, that's Ian Anderson. So it's the iconicness and the performance, it's the ability to get on stage and blow people away, to create very quirky gigs that are so full of humour. And the whole time they're playing live, you can see Ian Anderson's looking around like a crazed sort of, I don't know, bird almost. It's twitching and it's gurning, and it's just fascinating. And to play in arenas, you have to be able to take what you do and put it out there on a big scale. Jethro Tull could do this. Now, many of the other progressive rock bands had to do this with like huge sets and projectors, you know, building up walls inside them, or having, or, you know, sitting yourself in some sort of Icelandic space, you know, full of all this stuff so they could, you know, walk around. And, you know, bands like Yes are pretty iconic in terms of what they look like, but Jethro Tull are so iconic. I think that's what did it. It's the touring. So Aqualung goes to, you know, #1 in America. It's a huge hit, but they get labelled by the critics and as a progressive rock band, as being conceptual. I think what the better way of describing it is that they were literate. That's the difference. And people this time were, you know, used to bands that were singing about, you know, girls and, you know, being the best things in sliced bread. You know what most rock bands sing about. And so themes emerge. So the critics have also been literate. I think they like this at the time. They find it very intellectual and they go, ooh, look at Aqualung. That's like, you know, it's got these concepts running through it. It's a concept album. And Ian Anderson, being literate and very intellectual, looks at that and goes, well, that's not the case. It's not what we're doing. And he looks at this progressive rock thing, which he doesn't feel a part of. Phil Collins said the same thing with Genesis. How many of these progressive rock bands were just doing their thing and then looked around and went, what, they're calling us progressive rock? This is a really interesting thing because what we have in progressive rock is actually about 5 really massively successful bands. And if you take the sounds of those bands, which are all completely different, and mix them all up, right, that is what we now generically call progressive rock. And what's interesting, that there is really no more band, except perhaps Gentle Giant, which is as complex as Jethro Tull. Once they find out that they've been labelled a progressive rock band, they decide to go at it full whack. And Thick as a Brick, which is one track over two sides, is so unbelievably complex. And another thing I want to say about Thick as a Brick, you know, these are the things that struck me going through the albums, is this album contains improvisation. I'm talking proper improvisation. The band go into things and they take off. It's not like Dave Gilmour overdubbing a nice guitar solo over something that's been structured. There's points on Thick as a Brick where they are playing incredibly constructed, tight arrangements. And it's other bands, other parts where they just let loose. And when you listen to live, there's points when you listen to a live Jethro Tull, like the album Bursting Out, where when Ian Anderson starts improvising on the flute, we basically have a version of jazz rock. So, and this goes right back to the first album. So Jethro Tull are also pioneering a sort of British jazz rock, which is selling in the millions, and is being seen by millions of people live. You know, the reason why I'm saying all this, the reason why I'm giving so much credit and really trying to explain the genius of this band is because more than any other band, they're done in by the critics, right? And they do not fold, right? So imagine you've got a #1 album all over the world with Thick as a Brick, and it's completely insane. And you've probably sat there thinking, we thought everyone was going to be bemused by this. We're like anarchists. We wanted to like upset the world, and everyone go, what the hell's this? And so Ian Anderson at that point rubs his hands together and goes, well, let's really do it. Thick as a Brick can be seen in a way, and this is the way I wanted to imagine it, because this helped me when I was going through the albums. Thick as a Brick can be seen as their Tommy. It's this idea of creating a rock opera, all right? And it explores as a theme this idea of what art is and how art can be misunderstood and how art is taken by the media and then turned into something else. So they're exploring, before the critical onslaught, that very thing, and they are doing it through the medium of the British newspaper, these sort of scandal rags that you know, were back then allowed to say whatever they wanted about people. But rather than it being a parody of the Sun or the Mirror or the News of the World, it's a parody of a small local newspaper with all the small foibles. We have the normal person, and the normal person can be like Stephen Bostock, this little strange teenage genius, which has written this poem that's so wonderful that Jethro Tull have decided to set it to music, and that's what the album is. But he gets turned on by the people around him. It's the same theme that's explored on Edward Scissorhands. It's this idea of somebody, a young person born into a situation where their talents and skills at once make them sort of famous or infamous, but at the same time, their skills disable them. And I think this gives us an idea about Ian Anderson's vision, which I am very sympathetic to. So that's what that's about. And it's the same theme as Tommy, isn't it? Tommy is the same thing as this like the child born into this sort of post-war world where his disabilities, the things that make him different, also turn him into sort of almost like a messiah figure. So I would say there's three things there that we can group together: Edward Scissorhands, Tommy, and Thick as a Brick, which are exploring the same theme. I think Life of Brian does it as well. It's a certain theme that emerges. It's about fame, creativity, and the awful machinations that go between the two. Thick as a Brick goes to #1. It's bizarre. You know, and I think it's testament to the Ian Anderson. I mean, the music's brilliant, and there's some really catchy tunes on there in amongst all the complexity. But also, Ian Anderson can talk about very complex things, and then on another level, talk about quite simple things, and then another level, create lines which stick in your head, right? The virtuosity of this band is incredible, but you can see I'm talking about the lyrics. Jethro Tull is a band where we have to deal with the lyrics. Yes, Ian Anderson's lyrics are fantastic, but they're just sounds to fit the music and just paint pictures that go with the music. Ian Anderson's not like that. So he decides to follow this up. Now, you've got to see it from their point of view. They've had a huge hit. You know, everyone's built up. You've had Close to the Edge come out in 72. You've had Dark Side of the Moon in 73. You've had Tubular Bells. The world's ready for the epic of all epics. And in British culture, we have to go back to Paradise Lost, Milton, and this idea of a sort of epic voyage into the underworld. So here, where Thick as a Brick is there, Tommy, Passion Play is there, Paradise Lost, it's there, Milton. All right, I've got some notes here that I'm going to refer to because I'm in such a heavy territory, which is why I've decided to do this video in two parts, because I knew I would go there. Right, so yeah, it's all I've got on my notes is it says a Passion Play is their Pilgrim's Progress, which it is, and in that it shares the same theme as Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. It's a descent into the underworld. But again, this is done in this quirky fashion of taking this average English person and they die and then they go up to heaven and it's boring in heaven. And then they go down to hell and they don't like it in hell. And then they decide the best thing is probably to just be reincarnated as something else. That is the story. This is done within a track of such unbelievable complexity, of such unbelievable multi-layeredness. This is the progressive rock album. Forget Tales from Topographic Ocean. Forget Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Forget all those. This is the one. I think when I did my sort of the most proggy albums of all time, I think that was on the list. But at that point, I just knew it was a very complex album. Really listening to it, I think A Passion Play is incredible. Now, the Passion Play, of course, is an old English thing which goes back to a sort of church tradition of having a play which describes the Passion of Christ, which is Christ's crucifixion. On Aqualung, on Thick as a Brick, and especially Passion Play, what we are seeing is an anarchic English pulling at the pomposity of religious belief. That is, I think, the grand theme of Jethro Tull. And I think they're at their peak on Passion Play. I really, for a long time, had Passion Play at number one. But the critics slated it. They slated it, and they slated it to such an extent that at this point, Jethro Tull lose their way. Now, also, they'd had this awful time in the Chateau in France, which was this sort of residential recording studio, and they'd gone over there and they couldn't get a decent sound. They ate horse meat and they all got very ill. Recordings were made there and then they were shelved and they had to re-record them again. So the band as well is going through quite a lot of turmoil, but it's not internal turmoil. I think the band's quite tight at this point from what I can tell. But they give in, I think. And this hampers the next two albums, doesn't it? So if we look at the line of this, after Passion Play, we get War Child, Minstrel in the Gallery, and Too Old to Rock and Roll, which I always perceived in terms of the critics' view of this band as being their sort of rubbish albums. And they are absolutely not. But you can tell the hit they've had because War Child is a little bit of a stumble. The beginning and the end of this album is a little bit weak. And you can see how they structured it. They know that to put the good tracks in the middle. All right. Sea Lion, great track, that rocks. Skating Away on the Thin Ice of a New Day is one of their greatest moments. Bungle in the Jungle is great. And the other thing we hear as well, which may be another pandering to commerciality, Or it could be just an aesthetic thing that Martin Barr wanted to do, but the guitar becomes heavier. Jethro Tull, famously in the 80s, got the Grammy for the best heavy metal band of all time. And it was a big joke because Jethro Tull aren't a heavy metal band. But there is a tradition there. And I think they were able to grab that audience because of that sound. Now, if we look at the date of War Child and Minstrel in the Gallery, where we can see this heavy guitar tone coming in, we're talking 74, 75. So this is the same point that Rush is doing Rainbow Rising. We've got the emergence, Rainbow's doing Rainbow Rising, Rush are emerging. So another thing that doesn't get mentioned in terms of Jethro Tull, they also, alongside King Crimson, Rainbow and Rush and a few other bands like Black Sabbath, they're laying the groundwork for prog metal. And I think Barrymore Barlow's virtuoso drum style, with some of the most advanced double bass drumming that anybody ever did in the 70s, I would say the most advanced, is really the beginnings of prog metal. So this band are responsible for so much, but the critical appraisal of them has been affected our perception of them. But unlike bands like ELP, or Gentle Giants, they were able to actually withstand it, and these albums are very good. Minstrel in the Gallery is a masterpiece, and I think that's the big forgotten classic. It's an absolute masterpiece, and in terms of sound and virtuosity, it's probably their greatest moment, because it captures how incredible this band were. And this is another thing I want to discuss on this video, is that Jethro Tull, this acquisition of musicians from all these different places, and then they're not being, they're sort of self-admitted, Martin Barr's sort of inexperience, John Hammond not actually playing the bass particularly when he started. These ideas that Ian Anderson is training the band. And then all the way through this video, I'm terrified of calling him John Anderson. So if I have done that, which I'm sure I've done it at some point, I do apologise. If I haven't, I shouldn't have said it. Anyway, so if we look at by the mid-70s, there's a band who are knowing. The title, Too Old to Rock and Roll, Too Young to Die, is exploring it. And I've said this over and over again. The progressive rock bands knew by 74, 75 the limits of what they were doing. And Jethro Tull, I think, make the right decision to go back to what made them so important and explore the English folk aesthetic. And I think on the last 3 albums they make, Songs from the Wood, Heavy Horses and Stormwatch, these create a trio of albums that explore more than any other band I can think of the aesthetic, the English aesthetic. Sound-wise, the sound of the English aesthetic which we hear really, to my ears, sounds closest to John Renbourn and especially Bert Jansch. I think there's a huge influence from Bert Jansch in terms of the guitar playing and the sound of the voice and the way those songs dodge and weave. I have a big box set of Bert Jansch because I love Bert Jansch. And you can go back to 65, 66, where Bert Jansch is writing songs that are very Jethro Tully and very heavy in their lyrical content. It's not just virtuoso folk guitar. So we can also look at the bass players as well as creating a structure. You've got the sort of Glenn Cornick period, which is that early period, the bunker period, and then Barrymore Barlow comes in and John Hammond comes in, and he's not as musically adept in a way as Glenn Cornick, but he's able to do the job, and his bass player is incredible. But he wanted to become a painter, didn't he, John Hammond? He went off and became a painter. I checked his paintings out, and they are very Jethro Tully. It's a very accurate and competent representation of Britain. That's what he paints. He wanted to go off and do that. So when we look at the people going, although Ian Anderson can sometimes be portrayed as a little bit of a despot, they all go for their own reasons. At this point, they bring in John Glascock, who is, in Paul McCartney's words, the greatest bass player in the UK at that time. He's probably the greatest rock bass player in the UK at that time. But the poor guy's got this heart defect. He's out on tour. He's not looking after himself. By the time we get to Stormwatch, Ian Anderson gets rid of him because he's worried about his health. And a few weeks later, he dies of a heart attack at a very young age. And this rocks the band. So I hope I've told the story through of what I think happened to Jethro Tull, arriving in 1979 with the death of John Glascock, which really rocks Barrymore Barlow. He can't take it, so he's gone. John Glascock's no longer there. We've got Martin Barr, we've got John Evan, Dee Palmer. There's a certain bunch of people there. And at this point, Ian Anderson decides to make a solo album. And as he should, which is totally the right aesthetic thing to do, he goes and explores different ideas for Jethro Tull, bringing in a lot more sort of electronics, new wave influences from the pop music that was around at the time. And he makes this album. Now, this album gets... the record company look at it and they go, well, you've got Martin on it, Martin Barr's on guitar. Why don't we just call this a Jethro Tull album? Ian Anderson didn't want to do that, and he says it's his great regret, because when the album comes out, the rest of the band aren't on it. This classic band that was doing all this incredible stuff, and so often with certain bands, ELO's the same, right? Where you've got some guys writing the songs at the front, and everyone thinks he's a genius, and they do not consider the brilliance of John Evan, the brilliance of Dee Palmer, the brilliance of Barrymore Barlow. This is one of the greatest progressive rock bands of all time. And once they're gone, Jethro Tull is a different beast. And they get round it by pulling in session musicians like Mark Craney and Don Perry, which are all fantastic. But from that point on, the thing that's holding Jethro Tull together is the relationship between Ian Anderson and Martin Barr, which eventually at some point, which I can't remember, I think it's in the 2000s, that falls apart. Ian Anderson's voice has gone. He's a multimillionaire. God knows why he's kept doing this, but he's still doing it. And it's this thing which I think is similar to Yes, where now it's not really Jethro Tull anymore, is it? It's something else. I think the closest you'll get to Jethro Tull now is Martin Barr. So we have a very similar situation that we have with Yes, don't we? With Ian Anderson, I've done it the other way around. John Anderson with the Band of Geeks really being the true embodiment of Yes. But the true embodiment of Jethro Tull is Ian Anderson. And if he's up on stage playing the flute, that's what it is. But I think after A, we are dealing with a completely different beast. I actually think if the band had stayed together, they may have weathered the 80s even less well. And Jethro Tull sold some albums. But I'm going to leave you with this. I've tried to really explain the brilliance of Jethro Tull on this. I've really tried to, and I'm almost come at this as a shock, because I've put my head in it and gone, oh my God, this is one of the great progressive rock bands. Are they the greatest progressive rock band? They've got the best run of albums. They're creating masterpieces. Thick as a Brick is probably the most, along with Close to It, the edge, the sort of pinnacle of progressive rock. The band was absolutely virtuoso. The lyrics are incredible. As a live act, they are untouchable. Are Jethro Tull the greatest progressive rock band of all time? And is that because progressive rock is about the English aesthetic, and they brought that to bear so well that they actually confound those claims of overindulgence through their use of parody? Are they the Monty Python of rock? And it's fascinating that Passion Play, this album the critics slated, went to #1 in America. Passion Play is perhaps the most complex album, the most conceptually advanced, the most lyrically advanced. This is probably the heaviest, and I don't mean heavy as in heavy metal, I mean heavy as in conceptually and artistically. I think Passion Play is the heaviest album ever to go to a #1 in America, which is like going to #1 in the whole world. So if you look at them in that, with that lens, Jethro Tull really are one of the greatest bands of all time. Are Jethro Tull the greatest band of all time? Are they? Now, the only way to establish that would be to stand back a little bit and go, well, why are they not? So in the comments, if you can give me any reasons why you think Jethro Tull are not the greatest band of all time, right? And see where we get, because my gut feeling is they're not, and that this is a ridiculous thing to say, but I cannot think of a reason why. Fascinating stuff. I'm at the end of this video. Sorry it was a long one again, but we were dealing with Jethro Tull. At some point in the future, I will take on the 80s albums, but I don't think it will be as interesting as what we've just done, looking at these 12. For those of you who know Jethro Tull, I hope I have done them justice, because like I said, I wasn't an expert on them. I feel like I'm a little bit of an expert on them now, and I hope I retained all the facts that I've been reading up quite recently, and I was able to tell the story in an interesting way. If you thought I did, then please put a like on this video, because, you know, some of my videos are just silly jokes and I get up here and think, let's have a laugh at that. This one's taken a month. I've been listening to those albums, reading about them, watching interviews, watching live gigs. And another thing, the reason why I didn't put Bursting Out on this list or Living in the Past is because they would have come up so high, and I think I may put Bursting Out higher than Thick as a Brick. They were just at their peak when they made that album, so you get the band at their sort of technical peak, performance peak, playing all their best songs and improvising with brilliantly recorded sound. This is a hell of a band, isn't it? So if you like this take, then please subscribe. If you want to give me a little bit of a tip in the old tip jar, because this one has taken a month to make, you might not believe it, but it has, and I'm going to edit it, and it's going to have all the things and graphics, all that, so that'll probably take me days, you know. So if you want me to do this sort of video, and not just sit there looking at cruddy 1980s videos and taking the mickey out of them, then please do that, you know, like, subscribe, and support me doing this, because really this is what I want to do. And this idea of taking a band I'm not so familiar with and spending a month, you know, exploring it from my point of view, I find it so fascinating, and I feel so lucky that I've got a sort of job where I can actually take the time to do that, especially on bands that I know I love. What's beeping? This computer here keeps beeping, and every time I go up, it doesn't tell me why it's beeping. And it's beeping now. I put this thing into airplane mode, but this is beeping. I'm done. Sorry about. I'm trying my best on these videos. I know I'm not classic album review. I'm not polished at all. The light's been going up and down all the time, so sometimes I'll be sat in the dark, and sometimes it goes, if you notice that, it's all been going like ooh, but I don't know if you can see that. Anyway, I'm giving you my critique of this video at the end. I shouldn't do that. I should leave you to decide whether it's any good, you know. But I'm doing the Jethro Tull thing, you see. That's what I think their downfall was. But there was no downfall. That was what their little stumble was. We're done, aren't we? If you want to become a patron, links down below as well. I've said all that, haven't I? We're done, aren't we? Hour and 10 minutes on Jethro Tull. You can't complain, can you? See you on the next video.